You think cloud data is immortal? What a joke. Let me tell you about the day I made a $1 billion logistics empire beg for an outdated magnetic tape from the 1990s to save the livelihoods of 10,000 people. Do not scroll past this. This revenge does not happen in cyberspace. It is a cold, calculated stab directly into the fragile egos of tech-worshipping men in expensive suits. Hello to the amazing listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero operating budget to keep bringing you these tales of corporate justice. If you find today's story entertaining, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. I am 34 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I held the thoroughly unsexy, mostly ignored title of Internal Data Flow Administrator at Omnicore Logistics. Omnicore is a supply chain behemoth, a titan of the shipping industry whose top executives look down on the rest of the world from the 40th floor of a shimmering glass skyscraper in downtown Chicago. Up there in the clouds, the air is meticulously climate-controlled. The coffee is exclusively artisan roast, and the corporate atmosphere is completely detached from reality. The pristine hallways are heavily infested with fresh-faced, 20-something tech bros who throw around buzzwords like synergy, blockchain, and paradigm shift, as if they are magical spells capable of moving physical freight. I have always been the exact opposite of that entire culture. I am a staunch, unapologetic disciple of the analog school of thought. I do not blindly trust the cloud, and I certainly do not trust software that claims to fix everything without human oversight. The reason is simple. Omnicore is not just a shiny office building in the sky. Our actual lifeblood, the true engine of the company, consists of 50 massive, gritty, exhaust-filled warehouses scattered across some of the most remote and desolate regions of the country. Out there, on the concrete loading docks in the middle of nowhere, a Wi-Fi signal is significantly weaker than a corporate promise of an annual pay raise. To the arrogant suits on the 40th floor, the weekly payroll for our 10,000 blue-collar workers just magically appeared on their financial dashboards every Friday. But magic is just an illusion that hides the heavy lifting done by the invisible lower class. My secret to keeping the paychecks of 10,000 exhausted warehouse workers perfectly accurate, down to the absolute last penny, relied on a heavy, clunky, old-school physical server system that lived humming underneath my desk every single night. Long after the tech bros had gone home to sleep off their craft beers, I ran a highly customized routing software program I had painstakingly written myself. This script aggressively grabbed the offline time clock data from those 50 remote warehouses over secure physical lines. It forced all that raw data down onto a spinning mechanical hard drive, and then meticulously backed it up onto physical magnetic tapes before finally pushing the scrub numbers to the pristine screens of the finance department. Those clunky magnetic tapes were my absolute insurance policy. They were tangible. They were undeniably real. My peaceful, beautifully structured existence was violently shattered the moment Julian Vance stepped off the executive elevator. Julian was our brand new executive vice president of operations. He was a walking, talking cliché of Silicon Valley arrogance. He was utterly obsessed with green tech and artificial intelligence, always strutting around the office in a pristine black turtleneck, clearly believing he was the next great visionary of our generation. To Julian, anything that required a physical power cord or had actual moving parts was considered primitive, embarrassing trash. Almost immediately after claiming his massive corner office, Julian signed a multi-million-dollar contract with a startup called Aura. Aura was aggressively pitched as a revolutionary, fully cloud-based artificial intelligence human resources platform. The sales pitch promised it would automatically synchronize time and attendance in real time by constantly tracking the global positioning system locations of the employees' personal smartphones. It sounded spectacularly futuristic in a slideshow presentation, and the board of directors eagerly ate it up. I knew instantly it was a catastrophic disaster waiting to happen. I marched straight into Julian's office, standing firmly in front of his minimalist glass desk, and I laid out the stark physical reality of Omnicore's actual infrastructure. I explicitly warned Julian that our suburban and rural warehouses were constructed with heavy-duty, steel core insulation walls to withstand severe weather. I patiently explained that those thick metal walls acted exactly like giant Faraday cages, completely and utterly blocking out any global positioning signals and Wi-Fi connections from ever reaching the warehouse floors where the men and women actually worked. Julian did not even blink. He slowly shifted his condescending gaze from my face down to the heavy, metal magnetic tape reader resting on my cart. A cruel, arrogant smirk stretched across his face. He leaned back in his expensive ergonomic mesh chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me as if I were a pathetic relic from a forgotten century. The era of people clinging to analog like you is over. Exactly 3 weeks before the critical third quarter payroll closure, the purge officially began. Julian did not just want to fire me, he wanted a theatrical spectacle. He summoned me to the main executive conference room. It was a sterile, utterly transparent glass box situated dead center in the middle of the open-plan office floor. Every single employee outside those glass walls could see exactly what was happening. It was a modern corporate guillotine, designed specifically for public executions to instill fear in the remaining workforce. I walked in and sat down. Julian was already waiting, flanked by an uncomfortable-looking human resources representative and a towering, stone-faced security guard. Julian leaned forward, resting his forearms on the pristine mahogany table. He delivered his verdict with the smug satisfaction of a dictator stamping out a rebellion. Effective immediately, your position is being permanently abolished, Julian announced, his voice carrying a practiced, hollow corporate empathy. Aura is coming online this weekend to fully automate our entire global data pipeline. Frankly, maintaining those physical backup servers of yours is an absolute embarrassment to a modern tech company. We are a forward-thinking enterprise, not a museum for obsolete hardware. He slid a termination agreement across the smooth wood. The human resources representative nervously cleared her throat and demanded that I hand over all my digital access credentials right there at the table. They expected tears. They expected begging, or perhaps a screaming fit of rage. Instead, I gave them absolutely nothing. I maintained a chillingly indifferent posture that seemed to visibly unsettle the human resources woman. Without uttering a single word of protest, I pulled out my company-issued laptop. I calmly typed in my credentials, methodically transferred my administrative rights, and then permanently locked myself out of the corporate cloud network. I felt my pulse. It was perfectly steady. There was no anger, only the cold, sharp clarity of a chess player watching an opponent confidently step directly onto a hidden landmine. The burly security guard stepped forward, gesturing for me to return to my desk and pack my personal belongings under his strict supervision. I walked back to my cubicle, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes burning into my back. I gathered my few personal items into a standard cardboard box. Then, I pointed a steady finger toward a heavy, reinforced iron lockbox sitting securely under my desk. Inside that metal casing rested 5 pristine magnetic tapes. Those 5 tapes contained every single second of raw, unedited timekeeping data from the entire workforce for the past 30 days. The security guard hesitated, looking over his shoulder. Julian had followed us out of the conference room, eager to supervise my final moments of humiliation. He glared at the heavy iron box. "What is that?" Julian snapped, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer jacket. "Just my physical backup drives," I replied evenly. "The localized data from the warehouse floors." Julian let out a sharp, derisive scoff that echoed across the quiet office floor. He waved his hand with sheer disgust. "Take that analog trash out of my sight," Julian ordered loudly, ensuring the junior engineers nearby heard every word. "The company has absolutely no room for scrap metal. Take all your archaic garbage and get out of my building." A very faint, razor-thin smile touched the corners of my mouth. Understood, I whispered softly. I carefully lifted the heavy iron box, cradling it in my arms like a newborn child, and walked toward the elevator bank. The heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing me away from the 40 floors of corporate hubris. As I descended to the parking garage, a profound sense of peace washed over me. Julian was a fool blinded by glossy dashboard metrics. He was completely unaware of one fatal, devastating truth: Aura, his precious multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence darling, had never once been run through a localized offline stress test. It only existed in the perfect, theoretical vacuum of a high-speed internet connection. When I surrendered my administrative rights and locked my routing account, the automated scripts I had written died instantly. The vital though physical umbilical cord that continuously fed raw data from 50 isolated warehouses straight to the corporate headquarters had just been ruthlessly severed by their own hand. I loaded the heavy iron box into the trunk of my car. The engine purred to life, and I drove away from the towering glass skyscraper without looking back in the rearview mirror. I did not go straight home. Instead, I took a long, scenic detour through the quiet suburbs and stopped at a dusty, charming little antique shop. I spent a full hour browsing before I purchased a beautiful, completely manual, vintage French press coffee maker. It required no electricity, no cloud connectivity, and no artificial intelligence to brew a perfect cup. I drove the rest of the way home, unpacked my new toy, and boiled some water on my gas stove. As I slowly pushed the heavy metal plunger down through the dark, aromatic coffee grounds, I took a deep breath. My phone was blissfully silent. My calendar was completely clear. I poured myself a steaming mug and sat down by the window, thoroughly ready to enjoy a very early, highly anticipated holiday, while the billion-dollar empire behind me marched blindly toward a spectacular, fiery cliff. The official launch day of the Aura system arrived with all the arrogant fanfare one would expect from a bloated tech initiative. I heard through the industry grapevine that Julian even ordered expensive catered champagne for the software engineering team to celebrate the moment his fully independent platform went live. Up in their climate-controlled glass tower on the 40th floor, everything looked absolutely perfect. The Aura user interface was sleek, featuring dark mode aesthetics and glowing green checkmarks indicating that the cloud was active and healthy. But those beautiful green checkmarks were a spectacular, fatal hallucination. They were popping champagne to celebrate a massive, expanding void. Out in the real world, the nightmare was already quietly unfolding. At 50 massive logistics hubs scattered across the country, thousands of forklift drivers, loaders, and shift supervisors arrived at dawn. They swiped their radio frequency identification badges at the entrance just like they did every single morning. The physical time clocks beeped in acknowledgement, but that is exactly where the journey of their data died. The heavy-duty, steel-core insulation walls surrounding the facilities stood strong, doing exactly what they were engineered to do. They blocked out the severe weather, and in the process, they completely choked out every single global positioning system and Wi-Fi signal. The automated ping attempting to send their clock in times to the cloud crashed against a wall of solid metal and evaporated into thin air. This is where the sheer brilliance of Julian's artificial intelligence truly shined. Aura was programmed by 20-something developers living in metropolitan areas where internet dead zones are considered a myth. The system's core logic was ruthlessly, hilariously binary. It was coded to believe a very simple premise. If there is no active internet connection detecting the employee's smartphone location, then the employee is definitively not on the premises. It did not matter that these men and women were physically moving thousands of tons of cargo. To the multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence, they simply did not exist. By the end of the second week of the new billing cycle, the silent disaster had snowballed into an unstoppable avalanche. For 14 consecutive days, the cloud-based system seamlessly recorded that over 10,000 warehouse workers were committing unauthorized absences. 10,000 people, supposedly abandoning their jobs simultaneously across the nation. And the artificial intelligence did not raise a single red flag. It just kept dutifully logging zeros. Then came the automated reckoning, Because Aura was touted as an all-in-one, seamless human resources solution. It did not just track time, it enforced company policy. As the 14-day mark was officially breached, a catastrophic chain reaction was triggered. The software, operating entirely on its own flawless digital logic, generated and fired off automated mass termination warning emails to every middle manager across the nation. Worse yet, the preliminary payroll calculation completed its run. When it multiplied the hourly wage by 0 recorded hours, the dashboard finally updated the projected third-quarter payout. The system proudly returned a flat, mathematically perfect 0 for 90% of Omnicore's core workforce. When the regional managers opened their laptops and saw that their entire active workforce had just been flagged for automatic termination and zeroed out for the pay period, the pristine quiet of the Chicago headquarters was violently shattered. The phones on the 40th floor began to ring. They did not stop. It was a deafening, relentless symphony of absolute panic. Julian, suddenly realizing his glowing dashboard was actually a digital graveyard, frantically sprinted out of his office. The smugness was entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a pale, sickening terror. He burst into the technology department, screaming orders at the terrified cloud engineers. He demanded they immediately halt the automated payroll processing. He ordered them to execute a server rollback, to dig into the system's temporary memory banks and retrieve the raw, unsynchronized data from the local time clocks. He was desperate to find any digital footprint proving those 10,000 people had actually been working. But the absolute masterpiece of this technological failure was yet to be revealed. When Julian demanded the cached data, the lead engineer had to deliver a devastating truth. "The system does not hold on to failed syncs," the lead engineer stammered, his voice trembling as he physically backed away from Julian. "To aggressively optimize the cloud storage billing just like you requested, Aura is designed to purge unsynchronized cache after 48 hours. It treats stalled data as system bloat. It overwrote the temporary files. The data is permanently gone." The corporate headquarters descended into absolute, unadulterated chaos. The smell of artisan coffee was entirely replaced by the sharp, acidic stench of executive sweat. The disastrous news leaked down to the warehouse floors faster than any cloud synchronization ever could. Outraged by the automated termination emails and the terrifying rumor of empty paychecks, spontaneous wildcat strikes instantly erupted. In Texas, entire crews shut off their heavy machinery and barricaded the loading docks. In Ohio, workers walked out mid-shift, leaving millions of dollars of perishable freight rotting in the sun. There was no data. There was no money to run the payroll. The entire billion-dollar supply chain was paralyzing by the minute. Because of a smooth-talking tech executive and a line of ruthless code, Omnicore Logistics was now staring directly down the barrel of the largest class action labor law violation lawsuit in the history of the United States. The clock was relentlessly ticking down. There were exactly 48 hours remaining before the absolute, legally binding banking cutoff for the corporate payroll wire transfer. If the funds were not electronically dispatched to the clearinghouse by that exact second, the breach of contract would trigger an irreversible financial apocalypse. Up in the glass tower, Julian was no longer just sweating over the potential loss of his lucrative stock options or a blow to his massive ego. He was staring directly down the terrifying barrel of a federal investigation. Falsifying, or in this case, completely obliterating the labor records and wages of 10,000 working-class citizens was a serious criminal offense. The word prison was silently but heavily bouncing around the executive boardroom, hanging over Julian's head like a sharp blade. In a pathetic, desperate bid to save his own skin and salvage his plummeting career, Julian had authorized an astronomical emergency expenditure. He chartered a private jet to fly in a crisis response team of elite data recovery specialists straight from Silicon Valley. These were the kind of highly touted fixers who aggressively charged tens of thousands of dollars per hour. They strutted into the Chicago headquarters with their expensive laptops and an air of supreme confidence. They tore through the intricate network architecture, running the most advanced forensic diagnostics available on the market. But after several agonizing hours of searching, the arrogance completely drained from their faces. The lead consultant, a man who had previously promised a quick fix, slowly closed his machine. He looked at the gathered, breathless board of directors and shook his head in grim defeat. The data never reached the cloud, the lead consultant stated with brutal finality. It evaporated in the physical environment the exact moment it attempted to synchronize against the warehouse walls. There is absolutely no digital footprint. We have scoured every inch of the servers. No backup exists anywhere on your entire network. The executive boardroom went dead silent. It was the sickening sound of a billion-dollar company effectively flatlining. In that suffocating, heavy silence, an older, veteran network engineer who had miraculously survived Julian's recent modernization purges slowly raised a shaking hand. He looked terrified, visibly trembling as he addressed the furious executives who were desperately looking for a scapegoat. "There is one place," the old engineer stammered, swallowing hard and avoiding Julian's murderous glare. "The only surviving raw data, the exact, uncorrupted record of millions of hours of manual labor, does not live on any digital server. It is captured locally on those heavy magnetic tapes. The exact same tapes that Vice President Vance explicitly classified as scrap metal and ordered our former administrator to permanently remove from the premises." The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Suddenly, miles away in my quiet suburban home, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished surface of my solid oak dining table. It buzzed aggressively, paused for a fraction of a second, and immediately started buzzing again. I casually glanced over at the glowing screen. The caller identification rapidly cycled through a desperate hierarchy of power. First came the frantic calls from the Director of Human Resources, then the Chief Legal Counsel, and then, over and over again in a relentless barrage, came the rapid-fire calls from Julian Vance himself. I did not reach for the phone. I let it vibrate. The harsh, mechanical buzzing sound provided a rather lovely, rhythmic soundtrack to my peaceful morning. I slowly stood up, walked into my sunlit kitchen, and picked up my beautiful manual coffee press. I took my absolute time, slowly pushing the plunger down and pouring the steaming dark roast into a thick ceramic mug. I walked back to the dining table, sat down comfortably, and picked up a worn, dog-eared paperback novel I had been meaning to finish. I read a full chapter, occasionally sipping the rich, bitter coffee, while the expensive piece of glass and metal on my table danced in a state of absolute, manufactured panic. Only when I judged that their collective executive blood pressure had reached an unsustainable, highly dangerous peak did I finally reach out and swipe the screen to accept the incoming call. I did not even get a chance to say a polite hello. Julian's voice violently exploded through the small phone speaker. He was practically hyperventilating, completely stripped of his tailored, condescending arrogance. He was screaming in pure, unadulterated despair. He babbled wildly, tripping over his own words, desperately offering to immediately wire me a contract penalty payout equivalent to 5 full years of my previous salary if I would just get in my car and drive those backup hard drives to the corporate tower right that very second. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the silence on my end of the line. "I do not have any digital hard drives," I replied, my voice as cold, flat, and uncompromising as a frozen lake. "I only have archaic, analog trash in a heavy iron box, and as you made perfectly clear in front of the entire office, trash has absolutely no value on your pristine cloud, right, Julian?" Before he could utter another pathetic sob, I pressed the red button to sever the connection, dropped the phone back onto the table, and calmly returned to the next page of my book. Less than an hour after I disconnected Julian's pathetic call, the phone illuminated once more. The caller identification displayed a private, unlisted number, but I knew exactly who it was. The chain of command had finally snapped all the way to the absolute top. I swiped the screen and brought the device to my ear. The voice on the other end did not belong to a frantic middle manager or a panicked vice president. It was the global chief executive officer of Omnicore Logistics. This was a man who dined with senators and moved global markets with a single signature. Yet, in this moment, all the booming, commanding authority had been entirely stripped from his vocal cords. He did not issue a single corporate directive. Instead, he sounded exactly like a desperate, sweating gambler who had just pushed his absolute last remaining chip onto the roulette table and watched the ball land on the wrong color. He begged. I listened to him stammer through an agonizing apology on behalf of the entire executive board. He promised me immediate reinstatement. He promised me a massive corner office. I let him completely exhaust his script of empty corporate promises before I finally spoke. I told him I would agree to a face-to-face negotiation, but under no circumstances would I ever set foot inside his glass tower to do it. If they wanted my analog trash to save their billion-dollar empire, the mountain was going to have to drive out to the suburbs to meet the profit. I gave him the address of a gritty, outdated, entirely unpretentious American diner located right off the interstate highway, miles away from the city center. I specifically demanded that both he and Julian drive there themselves. I arrived early and secured a booth in the far back corner. The diner smelled strongly of burnt filter coffee, old fryer grease, and industrial bleach. The vinyl seats were patched with silver duct tape, and the flickering neon sign outside cast a harsh, red glow across the sticky laminate table. It was the exact kind of working-class establishment the executives on the 40th floor would actively cross the street to avoid. When the heavy glass door of the diner swung open, the two men walked in looking completely out of place. The chief executive officer wore a crumpled designer suit, his face pale and drawn. Julian trailed closely behind him, looking absolutely physically sick. The smug, technology-obsessed visionary in the black turtleneck had been entirely replaced by a terrified, hollow shell of a man. They slid into the cramped vinyl booth opposite me, instinctively pulling their expensive sleeves away from the sticky surface of the table. Without offering a single pleasantry, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, textured paper. I slid it across the table. It was not a digital document. It was not a polished corporate template. I had specifically typed it out myself on a vintage, fully mechanical typewriter. The black ink was pressed deep into the heavy fibers of the paper, completely immune to any cloud deletion, any synchronization error, or any server crash. The chief executive officer hurriedly put on his reading glasses and scanned the document. His eyes widened dramatically as he reached the compensation clause. I was not asking for an hourly consulting rate. I was not asking for my old salary back. My fee was definitively set at exactly 5% of the company's total third-quarter payroll fund. It was an astronomical, bloodletting sum of money. It was the kind of massive financial penalty that would force the board of directors to slash their own yearly executive bonuses down to absolute zero just to cover my invoice. He swallowed hard but did not dare argue the price. He continued reading, his brow furrowing at the operational terms. The contract explicitly stated that I was refusing any official corporate job title. I would not be an employee. I was to be legally classified as the exclusive offline data storage contractor. Furthermore, the contract included an ironclad, non-negotiable clause stating that Omnicore executives and technology personnel were strictly forbidden from interfering with, questioning, or auditing my physical methods of preserving the magnetic tapes. I owned the analog vault, and they were never allowed to touch it or govern it again. The chief executive officer slowly reached into his breast pocket and produced an expensive gold pen. Completely ready to sign away a massive fortune just to stop the catastrophic bleeding. "Wait," I commanded sharply, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the diner clattering plates. "There is one final, unwritten condition before that ink touches the paper. The signature means absolutely nothing until the psychological debt is paid in full." Julian finally looked up, his eyes darting nervously between me and the boss. I leaned forward, folding my hands neatly on the table, locking my gaze entirely on Julian. For this contract to become legally binding, Julian is going to send a company-wide email right now to every single one of the 10,000 warehouse workers, all the middle managers, and the entire executive board. Julian visibly recoiled, pressing his back hard against the taped vinyl seat. "What do you want me to say?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You are going to type a very specific, unedited admission of guilt," I instructed coldly. "You will explicitly state that your multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence system is a catastrophic, miserable failure. You will confess that it completely erased their hours. And you will conclude the email by stating that the only reason any of them will be able to pay their rent, feed their families, and keep the lights on this month is entirely thanks to the analog magnetic tape system maintained by the woman you publicly fired." Julian's face instantly flushed a dark, humiliating shade of purple. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire personality violently flared up one last time. "I cannot do that. I will not do that. That is professional suicide. It will completely destroy my reputation in the entire industry." He turned to the older man beside him. "You cannot possibly entertain this. It is outright extortion." The chief executive officer turned his head slowly. The look he gave Julian was utterly devoid of human warmth. It was the look a butcher gives a slab of spoiled meat. He did not just reprimand him, he roared. The sound echoed through the entire diner, silencing the few patrons sitting at the counter. "You arrogant, insufferable fool," the chief executive officer snarled, slamming his fist down onto the sticky table so hard the sugar packets violently rattled. "You have already destroyed us. We have barely enough time left before the federal regulators raid our offices and the labor unions burn our supply chain to the ground. You have absolutely zero authority left in my company. Effective this exact second, you are permanently stripped of all operational command." The older man pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Julian's chest. "Pull out your personal phone. Right now. You will type exactly what she dictates. You will hit send to the entire global distribution list, and then you will pray that she accepts my signature. If you refuse, I will personally ensure the corporate lawyers feed you directly to the federal prosecutors for gross criminal negligence." Julian was completely broken. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic, terrified stillness. With trembling, unsteady hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his sleek, expensive smartphone. A waitress in a faded pink uniform walked over, completely oblivious to the corporate execution taking place in her section. She slid a warm ceramic plate holding a large slice of cherry pie and a fresh mug of black coffee directly in front of me. I politely thanked her. I picked up my fork, cut a generous piece of the sweet tart pastry, and slowly brought it to my mouth. I sat back in the booth, thoroughly enjoying the rich flavor of the cherries, watching with absolute, unblinking satisfaction as the former visionary meticulously typed out the exact words of his own total professional destruction. He hit the send button to 10,000 people, his head bowed, with tears of pure humiliation stinging the corners of his eyes. I returned to the Omnicore Tower at exactly 9 o'clock that night. I did not carry a sleek laptop or a minimalist tablet. Instead, I lugged a massive, heavy-duty, reinforced aluminum suitcase through the sliding glass doors of the lobby. Word of the signed contract and Julian's humiliating company-wide confession had already spread like wildfire. As I stepped onto the 40th floor, the chaotic, panicked bullpen instantly fell dead silent. The sea of exhausted cloud engineers, panicked executives, and frantic legal advisors instinctively parted down the middle. I walked through them like a conquering queen returning to a besieged castle. I marched straight past Julian's former corner office and directly into the central server room. It was an ultra-modern sanctuary of pristine white walls, blinking LED lights, and silent solid-state drives. I heaved my heavy aluminum suitcase onto the central steel diagnostic table and unlatched it. I pulled out a heavy, slightly rusted, unapologetically ugly magnetic tape reader, resting there among the sleek glass and glowing fiber optics. It looked exactly like a prehistoric monster that had somehow wandered onto a futuristic space station. The chief executive officer and his remaining loyalists crowded around the glass door, watching me with bated breath. I did not say a word to any of them. I began the physical, undeniably tangible process of salvation. I forcefully plugged in the thick copper cables, routing the connections entirely away from the internal network. I bypassed the Aura cloud completely, establishing a direct, heavily encrypted pipeline straight to the external banking clearinghouse. I took the first magnetic tape from my iron box, slotted it into the machine, and pulled down the heavy mechanical lever. I reached out and forcefully flipped the main power switch. The machine jolted to life. The tape began to spin. It produced a loud, rhythmic, mechanical whirring noise that echoed through the sterile server room. To the tech bros outside the glass, it probably sounded like absolute archaic garbage. But to me, and to the 10,000 desperate families waiting in the dark across the nation, it was the beautiful, undeniable sound of life. On the monitoring screen, the raw, uncorrupted hours flowed seamlessly from the spinning tape directly into the banking portal. The progress bar crawled forward, ignoring all global positioning signals and artificial intelligence algorithms. It just read the raw truth and processed the math. The bar hit 90%, then 95%. Finally, a solid, glowing green box appeared with the words 100% complete. At that exact second, thousands of miles away across the country, a beautiful symphony erupted. Inside distribution centers, on loading docks, and in modest living rooms, the notification chimes of thousands of cell phones rang out in perfect unison. The payroll had officially cleared. The money had arrived. The fatal knot had been completely severed. Before the cheering could even begin in the corporate bullpen, the heavy glass doors to the server room swung open. The same burly security guard who had escorted me out weeks ago stepped inside. But this time, he walked right past me. He approached Julian Vance, who was standing numbly in the corner, without a single word. The guard grabbed Julian by the arm and marched him out of the room, down the hall, and into the night elevator. There was no severance package negotiation. There was no farewell speech. He was just gone. The chief executive officer let out a massive, trembling sigh of relief and stepped forward to shake my hand, but I was not finished. I smoothly ejected the tape, placed it back into my box, and then did something that made the remaining executives freeze in absolute shock. I lifted the heavy tape reader and placed it inside a massive, custom-built, solid-cast titanium safe that I had ordered my private contractors to bolt directly into the reinforced concrete floor of the server room earlier that afternoon. I slammed the heavy titanium door shut and turned the locking mechanism. I pulled out a single, rough-cut, physical brass key. I held it up under the sterile fluorescent lights and then slowly pressed it into the palm of the chief executive officer. Your beautiful, expensive cloud can be hacked. It can be accidentally deleted, and it can suffer catastrophic glitches, I said, my voice sharp and echoing off the glass walls. But this vault cannot be broken by a single line of digital code. Keep this key safe, because from this night forward, every single piece of core human resources data must pass through this physical, mechanical lock. Welcome back to the analog era. I turned on my heel, grabbed my empty aluminum suitcase, and walked confidently toward the elevator, leaving an entire billion-dollar technology empire permanently, helplessly dependent on a primitive piece of cold, hard metal. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story of corporate justice and want to help keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen, or use the PayPal link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your generous contribution allows us to pay our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families, and ensures we can continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and stay strong out there.